We're going to start here by talking about detailed testing approaches. And basically, how do I take each of these phases, each of these approaches we've talked about, and break them down into an overall test plan? So early on here in this second week, we're going to be talking about some detailed stuff, such as white box and black box testing. But we also later on are going to be dealing with some high level stuff of how do I formulate the test plan and break it into phases. And our individual project is going to be largely on strategy. So we're going to jump back and forth this week on high level and low level stuff. Because once we get to week 4, you're going to be asked to pull a lot of stuff together that you may or may not be ready for if we don't start talking about some of these details now. So use the chat time as much as we can now. So at the lowest level, fundamentally what testing comes down to for me is inputs and outputs. We're saying that I'm going to do this thing, and based off of the way the system's defined and how I think the system works, I'm expecting this other thing to happen. A stimulus response, essentially, that's going on inside of there. So when I take this feather and put it next to your feet, I'm expecting you are going to giggle because it is ticklish. Very, very basic behavioral type stuff that we're looking at. So in order to test functionality, I need to start with understanding what the appropriate behavior is going to be. That's where that inputs and expected outputs is really vital, because we need to agree on what the appropriate behavior would look like when it's all said and done. We need to be able to measure it in some way that is agreed upon as being the correct behavior. And so we need to write requirements that give us a good detail of what's going to happen here. So think of it this way. If you're going to do your taxes, how do you prefer to get that done? So at some level, I have my requirements. There's federal law, there's IRS rules, interpretations of the law that tell me what I need to pay based off of what and what things I can deduct and all that sort of stuff. And so when I'm going to go off and take those requirements, those rules, and test the inputs and outputs, there's 2 ways I can do that. One of them is I can hand them over to a tax professional, an accountant or something like that, and they can go off and do all of the calculations and all the formulations. They can look up the rules, and they can look at the details, and they can see what each step of the way looks like. And then from my standpoint, I see the inputs, here's my W-2s, here's my receipts, and I see the outputs. This is the check I get back or the amount I owe. The other way is I do all the work I just described that the accountant's going to do. I go through and I grab the forms. I go through and I do the calculations. I go through and I understand the rules. I go through and determine if I am eligible for the rules. And then I end up with the same results. Now, both of them are the same approach. There's different circumstances in which I would do one versus the other. For instance, I might have somebody else do my federal taxes, but I might live in a state that's pretty simple. I just take my federal taxes, boom, knock it out, and there's my state. For instance, when I do my online stuff, I've used a couple different. I've used TurboTax, I've used TaxAct, I've used, what's the other one? The H&R Block one. I've used all those over the years. I almost never will pay extra for the state because, yes, it's convenient, but when you're going to go charge me $25, $30 to file the state thing, it takes me about 20 minutes to go through my federal form and port it over to the state and file it for the state. I'm not going to pay you $30 to save me an hour's time. That just doesn't make sense. So sometimes I do a little bit of each. Now, this is analogy speaking. It's not literal, but it does apply into the idea of testing, particularly when we talk about black box and white box testing. Black box testing is the idea that I know what the system's supposed to do. I'm supposed to produce my tax form. It's supposed to buy something and ship it to me. I have requirements that tell me that. I just need to know what things I need to provide and then what the response should be. I don't care how it gets done. So again, I'm going to go buy something on Amazon. I say this is the thing I want. This is how many I want. I know how much it's going to cost. And then at the end, that's my inputs. The expected outputs is my credit card has been charged for that amount, and whatever I ordered shows up on my doorstep. The fact that Amazon had to, go to a warehouse that is being stocked by some third party that then ships it up to a plane, which then goes to Louisville, which then throws it in a truck and goes to Indianapolis, and then throws in another truck and comes to me. That all that is irrelevant. That's all details behind it as far as I'm concerned. I don't care how it works. The only time I might sort of kind of care is if all of a sudden I order something that looks like it's available and they tell me it's not available. I say, well, what's up with that? Why can't Amazon in this day and age know how many things are available in the store and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's where I start to care about the details a little bit. But if it shows up, I don't. When I do start to care about the details, then I get into this idea of white box testing. I want to know exactly how this thing is implemented. So this is the difference between, say, blood diamonds and or just any random food you buy versus knowing the sourcing of where your stuff comes from. They're going to be friendly diamonds or locally grown food or something like that. Again, analogy. But in the IT sense, what I do care about is not just the fact of what the requirements are, but I want to ensure there's integrity in how this thing's done. Many of you have already started suggesting, I'm going to test this login capability. And I'll suggest that login capability should never, ever be done as a black box testing. Because it's security. It's the details matter. I need to know not only that I can log in and that I can log out, and that if you put in the wrong username and password that you don't log in, I need to know that there's no way to hack that system, that there's no way to get around that system. That's stuff that should always be white box testing. Now, there's going to be some black box high stuff over the top. Hey, does it work? But there's also needs to be some integrity testing inside of it. And so each of these are important. In white box testing, some of you will write down, must see the source code. That's not entirely true. Sometimes the design doc is good enough. Sometimes the vendor supplied user manual is good enough to be considered white box testing. It's just saying that I'm going to know a little bit about how the system's put together when I formulate my test. And again, it's an approach. It's not a phase. It's not a separation. I can do white box testing as unit testing, of course. I normally do. I can do white box testing at user acceptance testing. My user acceptance testing might really want to know, okay, when I ship this thing, where is this being shipped from? Because if I ship it out of Minneapolis instead of St. Paul, then it's going to cost me an extra tax because Minneapolis has an extra tax for their city council put in that St. Paul doesn't. And so I don't want to pay that extra tax. Okay, I don't know if that's true in any sense, but it's two cities everybody knows. But the point being is I might care exactly about how it's done because I might know more details about that. That's something I want to look at. So that's something to consider as far as white box versus black box goes, and each of them can be used appropriately and together. Now, black box is most commonly used because it's looking at the requirements and the interfaces. Normally when I get to regression testing, I'm almost doing everything in black box. I don't care about the details. I just want to say, is the high level stuff working? Maybe one or two details, but generally just the high level stuff. Where white box comes in on anything that's really mission critical, anything I really need to have happen, I need to know it works, every bit of it works. Pretty much anytime I test code the first time, I'm going to do some level of white box testing. And so it's applied at unit level most often, but again, can be done anywhere. That's the keys, the importance. So they're not mutually exclusive. I can't say, well, unit testing is all white box testing and functional testing is all black box testing. Yes, functional testing is mostly black box testing because I'm testing requirements, but there might be aspects of the architecture or the implementation that I really do need some information on, maybe just simply to validate something. If I say the user changes password, it has been updated, so I can go through and I can test that by logging in again in theory, but how do I know that the old password is gone, replaced, or otherwise inaccessible? I still would have to have some sort of understanding of the implementation to go off and check that. If there's security or data archiving or something like that, and I need to test. So there's sometimes requirements get into fuzzy and get into both.